This LOS is compare types of trade and capital restrictions and their economic implications. Trade and capital flows, restrictions and agreements. So on this slide we're going to look at some definitions that I highlighted the key ones in red. A tariff is a tax levied by a government on imported goods. It's intended to protect domestic industries. It increases the welfare of a domestic economy, one, if there is no retaliation, and two, the deadweight loss is less than the benefit from improving trade. An import quota is a restriction on the quantity of a good that can be imported. It's controlled through import licenses, and importers earn quota rents if they charge a higher price with a quota. An export subsidy is a payment by a government to a firm when it exports a specified good. It encourages firms to shift to export goods and increases the domestic price. A voluntary export restraint, VER, is a voluntary limit on goods exported to a specific country. It allows exporter to earn quota rents as well. Continuing with some definitions with regards to trade and capital flows, restrictions, and agreements, domestic content provisions are requirements that a specific portion of value added or components be produced domestically. So you could see that sometimes in the case of the auto industry, a car may be assembled in a country and certain parts are imported, but certain parts have to be value add components have to be produced domestically. Capital restrictions are controls placed on ownership of assets, either of foreign assets or of ownership of domestic assets by foreign persons or firms. The effect of restrictions on trade and capital depends on whether the country is a price taker or can affect the price. A small country, in the context of international trade, is a price taker. A large country in this context can influence the price. Okay, now we're going to walk through this exhibit that's in the text with regards to the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, the tariff revenue or quota rents, and the national welfare. So the way that this starts is that P star is under free trade, the world price would be P star, okay? So the domestic supply then would be at Q1 under free trade. The domestic supply would be Q1, and you can see at that price what the domestic demand would be then. It would be at Q4. Okay, and imports are Q1 to Q4. They would have to import. This is what they would import. Okay, because at that world price with free trade, that's how much the domestic supply is. That's how much the domestic demand is. So you'd have to have some imports from Q1 to Q4. Now we're going to look at imposing a tariff, which is obviously going to raise the price. So when we introduce a tariff, we're going to increase the price from P star to P1, okay? And okay, so after the tariff is introduced, we can see that the domestic supply is going to increase to Q2, but the domestic demand is going to decrease to Q3, okay? That's with the imposition of the tariff. So you can see that we're getting some triangles and some boxes that are starting to be formed here. So you can see there's going to be a reduction in imports from Q1 to Q4 before the tariff. Now we can see that we're going to be importing this amount from B to D, okay? So the consumers suffer a loss of consumer surplus because of the increase in price. And this effect is represented by the areas A plus B plus C plus D in the exhibit. A plus B plus C plus D, you can see that's the loss in consumer surplus, which is why we have a negative sign in front of the bracket. The producer surplus is plus A because they're being protected by the tariff. The price has gone up. The tariff revenue or quota rents is plus C. Okay, that's and the national welfare has been affected by negative B minus D. Okay, so the government gains tariff revenues on imports from Q2 to Q3, and this is represented by the shaded area C. Okay. Now this LOS doesn't exactly say calculate, but there is a blue box example in the text, which I've put in the PowerPoint with the chart beside it, just so I can use my pen. And I think we should go through it just so that we understand some of the calculations. So in this one, it's analysis of a tariff. South Africa manufactures 110 tons of paper. So here we are here. This is 110 tons at Q1, okay? And domestic demand for paper is 200 tons, which is here the Q4. So we can see that they're importing 90 tons, okay? So we'll just draw that right here. And the price, the world price, is at $5 per ton, okay? So they decide to impose a tariff of 20%, which would increase the price to $6. So you can see $6 minus $5 equals the $1. So it's going to be a $1 per ton tariff, okay? And at that, so now we know that we're going to have some new quantities. At that price, domestic production is going to increase to 130 tons. So we can see here we have a difference of increase of 20 tons, okay? So I'll write that there. But demand is going to decrease to point D, and demand is going to decrease to 170 tons. So we can see that we have a decrease in demand of 30 tons. So I'll just write that up here, okay? So then the question is to calculate the loss in consumer surplus arising from the tariff. And that's A plus B plus C plus D. Okay, and then calculate the gain in the producer surplus from the imposition of the tariff. Calculate the gain in the government revenue arising from the imposition of the tariff, and calculate the deadweight loss. So the solution to number one, the loss in consumer surplus, which is A plus B plus C plus D, made into a negative, is the $1 times 170,000. That's the new volume at D, plus 1/2 times $1 times the 30,000. Okay, so that gives you 185,000. The solution to number two, the producer surplus, and that's area A here, is the $1 times the 110,000 plus 1/2 times $1 times the 20,000 that we needed here. Okay. The next solution to number three, the gain in the government revenue, that's area C. That's going to be easy to calculate. We can see that's going from 130 to 170, which is 40,000 tons. It's 40,000 tons times the $1 tariff. That's 40,000. And the deadweight loss because of the tariff, that's areas B plus D. The way that we calculate it is 1/2 times $1 plus 20,000 tons, which is the 110 to the 130, plus 1/2 times $1 times the 30,000, which was the 200,000 to the 170, okay? Now, not 100% clear whether that's a nice to know or a need to know, but it's a good to know, and I always, if you want to do well in the CFA exam, sometimes you really want to understand these things 100%, even if it doesn't say calculate, but to work through an example with the figures and do your best to try to understand that, okay? Okay, having gone through that blue box example, as I said, you may not need to calculate, but if you have a strong understanding of what's happening here, then looking at a table such as this, where we look at a tariff and we look at the impact on the importing country, then it becomes really easy to understand. So first of all, the producer surplus is going to increase. We saw that because domestic production is going to increase, so they benefit from the tariffs. The consumer surplus is going to decrease. The government revenue is going to increase because of the tariff. We saw that. And the national welfare is going to decrease in small country, could increase in a large country. So for me, in my mind, it may not be a question with regards to the calculation, but it could be a question with regards to most likely or least likely, what would the impact be on the importing country. And so I think this table is the most important thing to understand. being able to do the calculations is maybe secondary, okay? But as I said, overkill, I like to go through all those blue box examples, and the more time you have, the more you understand the higher mark you're going to get, and you're going to pass, okay? So now we're going to look at the import quota with regards to an importing country. The producer surplus is going to increase. Yeah, a lot of this is just common sense. I've restricted imports. So as a producer in the importing country, I'm going to be helped. It's going to increase my surplus. The consumers are going to decrease. The consumers, you can see here, always being affected negatively by a tariff, an import quota, an export subsidy, or a voluntary export restraint. So that one's fairly easy to understand. Okay? You can see here domestic consumption decreases, 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 and decreases. Okay? Now, with regards to import quota, in terms of the government revenue, it could be mixed, all right? And the national welfare decreases in a small country, could increase in a large country. With regards to an export subsidy, and we're looking at the export country, well, we know that for the producer surplus, it's going to increase because they're being helped. The consumer surplus, as we said, always decreases. The government revenue is going to fall, and the national welfare is going to fall. So continuing here with the voluntary export restriction on the importing country, okay? It's going to increase the producer surplus. Again, always decreases the consumer surplus. Government revenue, no change. It's a rent to foreigners, and the national welfare decreases, okay? Over here, panel B, we're looking at the effect of alternative trade policies on price, production, consumption, and trade. Again, we're looking at the tariff, the import quota, the export subsidy, and the volunteer export restraints. So the import, and we're looking here at on a tariff on the importing country. The price increases. We saw that before. Domestic consumption decreases. Domestic production increases, and the trade imports decrease. And that's exactly as we analyzed on the graph. Very easy to understand now, this table, if we relate it to having a pretty good understanding on the graph. And then we can answer any questions, most likely, least likely, okay? With regards to import quota on the importing country, again, the price is going to increase, domestic consumption decreases, domestic production increases, and the trade's imports decrease. So that's fairly easy to understand because you can see that's all exactly the same, okay? Now, with regards to an export subsidy, of course, on the exporting country, the exports are going to increase. That's easy to understand. The price is going to increase, domestic consumption is going to decrease, and domestic production is going to increase. That's the whole point of having an export subsidy, is to increase your exports. So, of course, your domestic production is going to increase and your exports are going to increase. So, again, I said a lot of this is not pure memorization, but it's just to understand it. A lot of it's just common sense. Now, with regards to a voluntary export restraint, you can see the effect on the impact on the importing country is that the price increases, the domestic consumption decreases, domestic production increases, and imports decrease, okay? So again, when you first look at this, studying some of the economics seems a little bit intimidating. Oh, we've got a graph, we've got a table, there's a lot of information there. But all in all, a lot of it is fairly common sense. So we'll just do a couple of practice questions to check our understanding. Which type of trade restriction would most likely increase domestic government revenue? A, a tariff, B, an import quota, or C, an export subsidy? Okay, I think you'd be happy to see a question like this on the exam, and you can see that despite the graphs and the charts and all that data, this should be fairly common sense. What kind of trade restriction would most likely increase domestic government revenue? Well, it's a tariff, okay? An import quota would not do anything to increase government revenue. That would reduce the amount of imports coming into the country. And an export subsidy is paying money to exporters to help produce their production and to increase their production and increase their exports. So this is a very easy question. A is correct, and we've gone through the example. We saw that a tariff will most likely increase domestic government revenue. That was a positive number. A tariff is a tax on imports collected by the importing country's government. So a very easy question. Two more practice questions to finish this LOS. So you can see how the questions are based on the table and it's not that difficult. So another quick one, which of the following trade restrictions is likely to result in the greatest welfare loss for the importing country? A, a tariff, B, an import quota, or C, a voluntary export restraint? Okay, this question was maybe a little bit trickier, but not too bad. So C is correct. With a voluntary export restraint, the price increase induced by restricting the quantity of imports accrues to foreign exporters and or the foreign government. So think about it. A voluntary export restraint, you're exporting less. That's going to hurt more than a tariff. With a tariff, you had some government revenues and you increased some of your local production. And also with an import quota, what did you do? You restricted some imports. So again, you boosted your domestic production. But a voluntary export restraint doesn't help your domestic producers, and so therefore it has the greatest welfare loss for the importing country. And one last quick practice question to finish this LOS. A large country can A, benefit by imposing a tariff, B, benefit with an export subsidy, or C, not benefit from any trade restriction? Okay, the correct answer here is A. A large country can benefit by imposing a tariff. By definition, a large country is big enough to affect the world price of its imports and exports. A large country can benefit by imposing a tariff if its terms of trade improve enough to outweigh the welfare loss arising from inefficient allocation of resources. So again, I put the chart here. It's a little bit small, but with regards to a tariff, this was the important area to recall, that the national welfare is decreased in a small country, but it could increase in a large country. So that's what we needed. And also import quota as well is the same impact. If the national welfare was decreased in a small country, could increase in a large country. So again, when I'm looking at a question like this, I always think, well, how could the question be changed but be fairly similar to be a new multiple choice? So a large country could also benefit by imposing an import quota. But we see with regards to an export subsidy or a VER that the national welfare decreases, okay? So, nice little question to end on. A fair bit to memorize with regards to this LOS, but a fair bit of it is fairly common sense and not too difficult. And that's the last slide for this LOS. Thank you.